seemed like woodworking was a good way to express time. Traditionally, we've always done that. Your grandfather's clock, for example, square, boxy. Time really was a lot more dynamic than that. I built my first clock. That's the second one to the left of the camera. I built, which is not part of the show, is this guy. It has hands that move, and that's time. This kind of time is just two things that move relative to each other. Enough, we call it a minute. They move farther than that, we call it an hour. It's about maybe 3 minutes a month in terms of accuracy. They claim more, but it doesn't. It's the thing you can work with, and it's all we have. Something this small, you can put it into anything. Then I also discovered, this is called Baltic plywood. It's unusual, it's very expensive. Comes from Finland, Estonia, and Russia. And its characteristics are it's a plywood, so each layer is crossways to the other. It makes it very, very strong. But it's not like the plywood you see in your houses. It's made with very thin plies, and it has no voids in it. There's no open spots. There's no clock that has little thin rings. If you had ordinary wood, you would have grain to deal with. It would split. You couldn't make anything as delicate as that. Having the space, the tools, and time. It's amazing what you can do if you have space, tools, and time. If you think about proto-humans, many years ago, Homo sapiens were dominant about 70 million years. Creatures essentially extend back to several million years. The humanoid species goes back over 200,000 years. Well, big deal. But how did those people, what was their relationship to time? As they lived their lives, what was time to them? Time was sunrise, sunset. The tide went up, the tide went down. Maybe after a while the idea of the solstice and equinox, all of this combined to make it just a little more measurable in a sense. But it was not measured except in those terms. Sundials appeared about 1500 BC. First kind of way of measuring time. Depended on the day, how late the day was, whether there were clouds and all those kinds of things. So the early time, as we see it historically, is pretty, how can you say it, not very granular. It's in very amorphous terms. And then we began to see things like water clocks, the beginning of the concept of 16 or 60 minutes or 60 units or 12 units in some kind of a daily cycle. A major difference happened when the mechanical clock evolved. For the first time, you had the ability to cut time into reasonably accurate intervals. And first there was the pendulum, an amazing thing that essentially had a period that was constant. And then there was the mechanisms that took the movement of the pendulum and essentially made it so it continued to happen over time. There were many improvements. We began to call them clocks and many other terms. Initially, the first clocks were used in monasteries because the monks essentially functioned on the basis of 7 different time periods during the day to say prayers. But even in all that time, mankind, most of mankind had no access to a clock of any kind, clocks being more accurate. And then came the Industrial Revolution. Now, imagine that you are the conductor of a train, and you're traveling between here and Albuquerque, and there's one track. But there's two trains going in opposite directions. And that means that you have to know when to get out of the other guy's way. It was done with time. And the only thing that you could do that made sense to keep you safe and to make the system work was essentially to have a clock that said, or timepiece, or conductor's watch, as they were called. And I'm going to go down this rail, and I'm supposed to be at the other place at 12:02, and I have to get onto a siding, and he has to be up here by 1:30. And so the necessity for accuracy became of huge importance. It changed everything in a time that was itself changing. And if you look back at navigation, for example, when to know how far you were east and west would make a huge difference in whether this satellite and that satellite, then if you do not put that adjustment in there for time warp, then your location is off by kilometers. And so this brings us into the last part, which is how all of this is going to affect us. When we found the Earth was flat, it didn't make much difference to our day-to-day operations. When we found that we were not the center of the universe and the sun didn't go around us, well, we all went out and planted corn the next day as we normally do. So a lot of the intuitive changes, a lot of the huge changes that have happened are intuitive but earth-shaking changes. So right now, there is the issue of quantum mechanics happening to our technology. There's some earth-shaking things coming, as important as the Earth is flat or the Earth is round. Because the implications of quantum mechanics and quantum physics can change or help us understand who we are, where we are, what's out there. Are there parallel universes? I mean, this sounds like a lot of crap in some ways. But, so we've gone from proto-human measuring their lives or measuring time with dawn and sunset to tinier and tinier and tinier and tinier and tinier little segments, and we call them all time. They're the same thing, but they're all different. And in a sense, if you think of your lives, you know, if all you had to worry about was, is the sun going to come up this morning with clouds or not? Versus the fact that it's 5:02 and I told my mother mother told me to be home by 5 o'clock, and it's maybe 20 after, or something like that. Time is, at what point does time become oppressive? I'm the familiar stranger. And it really is that way. And it has implications for us, probably for our great-children in ways that we don't even imagine. So that's why I find time fascinating. And it goes all the way, it involves us so much. For example, in Jane's interaction with time, is really, she's talking about how COVID changed time. Because if you were a mother in a house with two babies, or two young children who have to use the computer to go to school, and they're bored and they're cranky and you can't go out, time is very, very slow. Time does not have to be the movement of hands. Anything that oscillates, moves in any regular way is an expression of time. Your heart is a clock. Your brain is the clock. Your tapping foot.
My name is Jane Ellen Burke, and I'm an artist at the Taos Community Auditorium. And Work is a piece that I did during the last 3 years, and it marks the COVID-19 deaths in the United States. On February 5th, I just finished. I have completed this 3-year project. I was a student at UNM in printmaking class, and on March 15th, we got word that the university was closing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, I went home with all of my work and my supplies and tried to think about what I was going to do next and how I could work. Having been a person that has drawn a lot in my lifetime, I started back with drawing. And eventually, it took me several months to devise a way that I thought I could capture the effects of the pandemic in the United States. These 3 years, there are 1,112,000 deaths that have been marked. And so when you see that in actuality by a little hash mark, and you see the enormity of the numbers and is shown in this work, I think it is astounding to a lot of people. And they began to comprehend it and to understand that it was really a big thing and a very important reminder that life is short. And since that, time has changed for everybody in a million different ways. We are not like we were before the pandemic hit. COVID for me, during this 3-year period, was a real gift to do work that was more free-flowing and just different. And those pieces that I did in my studio, I called my lifelines. And I would work on the death lines in the morning and then continue with lifelines as I went along. The top row is the second year and the bottom row is the third. Continuation, I think, of alpha and beta. Then we get into summer, people are outside. Then we get the start of delta, and that eventually morphs into Omicron. 6th there to February 5th on the last one. So it's a little bit off. It's not completely month to month, but and I still wear a mask because I still believe there's still 450 to 500 people a day that are dying and catching this new variant.
I wonder if the CDC would be interested in seeing this representation.
I tried.
They don't want.
They don't want to be reminded.
I'm
Yes.
just really intrigued, you started out the statement being that nature is what your subject is and abstraction is your format for expressing. So just looking at these really intrigued me, how much consciousness, kind of like what she was asking, of how the image is developing. For me, I can see all these natural things, but the abstraction too. So I'm just curious how conscious, like as you're moving along, as she was saying, is it just mood, making a darker ring, or is there more of an awareness like, this is gonna, this change of rings or the intent of what it's saying or showing, it's gonna express it more, or is it very innocent just each day?
Well, it's just something that you just go chuck, chuck, you know, kind of thing. This piece certainly had a life of its own. It got out of, it started morphing. It just moved, and all of a sudden there were spaces that that were left, and that just happened. These are a little bit more controlled because they're smaller. I could see what my pencils, and I would make a mark for every person that died during that day. And I've done it for this long period. I had absolutely no idea that it would go on this long.
Time measured in each of the images, and it looks like denser and narrower tree rings.
Was feeling lighter, I'd do lighter pencils. If I was morose over the numbers, you know, I would do darker. And these are month to month. Nothing is normal. We'll never go back to what life was like before. Everybody, if you're young or old, you'll remember this period of time in your life. We didn't know what we were doing. And that piece is the first year of vaccines, and we didn't have good information. In the United States. And what this represents is 1/6 of the world's deaths from COVID, death in the world. Oh, what happened?
You start in the center and work out?
Yeah. If you look at that one, you can see it's about a ½ inch mark. That was the first mark I put in, and then it just kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And so that got to be too much to move around all the paper. I worked in a circle always, and so I had to try to match up the lines on the next sheet of paper, and then, you know, it just got to be too much. So I moved to the month to month.
And that very last piece of paper was empty.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite shocking, just to see that transition.
Well, I had
So
to
quickly.
wait. I couldn't get numbers until last week for February.
Yeah.
Being that nature is what your subject is and abstraction is your format for expressing. So just looking at these really intrigued me how much consciousness, kind of like what she was asking, of how the image is developing. For me, I can see all these natural things, but the abstraction too. So I'm just curious how conscious, like as you're moving along, as you were saying, is it just mood making a darker ring, or is there more of an awareness like, this change of rings, or the intent of what it's saying or showing?
It's just something that you just go chuck, 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 you know, kind of thing. This piece certainly had a life of its own. There were spaces that I had that were left, and that just happened. Figured out how to print by hand. People have been doing it for thousands of years, and it took the pandemic for me to be curious enough to go in there and figure out how to print. And that resulted in a lot of work that followed that lightened up. I would do this in the morning. I'd wake up in the morning, I would have my coffee, I would make my marks, and then I would move to my studio, and then I would have freer work that was more enjoyable. It was, but it gave me a purpose and all. But that's kind of how I worked all during this time, and as I said, it was a gift. It made me create a daily practice. It's fun. You know, the two things, hard work and fun. And so this was just a way that I could honor some people honor a lot of people that died. And so that gave me a lot of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I could continue doing my work in other ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, Janie? Here we are, the nation that supposedly had the most in the world, and we have the most deaths. It's kind of, and for me, it was listening to Trump and his on the television and saying, it's not significant, it's just a trifle, you know.
But one, the artist didn't want to do an artist talk. So we said, okay, well, what if we try something else where we bring a musician or musicians in and we have a dialogue. And so we've structured this in a way that we think it's going to happen, but we'll see.
What you do, has it changed what you want to express or how you play, or how has that affected your work?
Well, it was very sweet to get back playing in person with people. And I know one or both of y'all were with us one of the first times we were out. We were playing outdoors to begin with, and listeners would start crying. They're moved to tears just by the live music, which they hadn't heard for a while. And that's kind of underlines how poignant it can be.
All of a sudden, things got very different. I'm a teacher by trade, and literally within 2 weeks, I moved from a non-Zoom teacher to a Zoom teacher. I had to figure out how to do it. But various things happened, and we just didn't quite feel at home there anymore, so we went exploring and ended up in Taos, and that's how I met these guys, and that's how I started performing again. So. instruments here. This is still a violin, obviously. I feel very at home here. I feel like I'm surrounded by wood. Jen, I don't know if it's your intention, but they just seem so tree-like, tree-ring-like. And here I am playing a wooden instrument.
Watch out for the box elder beetles.
I don't think so, but this I recently started playing and it has a story. So, let's see here. My uncle is 92. He played this. I'm sorry for getting a little emotional, but it's a very personal story. It's been in my family a long time. So he played it when he was in high school in the 40s. And then they sent it to me and I played it in high school for a little while. I got this violin and sent it back, and he recently sent it back to me. And it really sounds good on Irish tunes, so I'm going to share an Irish tune on this. And Irish tunes are very timeless as well, so this one especially. It's called Rights of Man, and I believe it has been around long enough to be named after Thomas Paine's treatise on, we'll call it human rights, even though the name is woefully out of date, but rights of all of us humans, we'll call it that. But I'm so happy to have this violin. Recently, a student sent me a link of a woman in Denmark. I believe her name is Janine Jensen, and she was hooked up with a foundation, and she got to use not just one, but 12 Stradivari recordings. Can you imagine that? So, you know, this one is 100 years old, but those Strads, what are they, 300 years old? And they're like still just as good, you know? So the violin endures. Computers, not so much. All right.
Rights of Man.
You want to kick it off?
Yeah, well, let's see.
love that you brought up the timelessness of the tune. And I think to answer your question in another way, something about playing this music that at the very least sounds old. A lot of the stuff we play is actually pretty newly composed in the last 60 years or so. But it's all in the tradition. So a lot could be said there, but that juxtaposition of traditions that are long-standing and yet that perhaps infinite permutations.
Keep evolving.
Yeah.
They keep evolving.
Yes. Yeah.
And the music is rooting and grounding in so many ways, and I think that helps us navigate into the unknown and the unprecedented.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think of your work as a representative of digestion, of chaos, and very significant in that.
When he got upset was to throw a rock through a window, any window, a window. And so the name of this tune is Ernest T. Grass, and there's a point in the tune where the music tries to paint a picture of the rock sailing through the air and then crashing through the window. So it's kind of interesting that way.
We suspend time in one little spot.
And hopefully a vision of an event in space through our manipulations of time.
That rock sailing through the window.
If you're getting into the discussion of the quantum, this banjo will wipe your slate clean out.
But why should the clock not reflect the beauty, the complexity, the continuity, the warp of space and time itself?
Oh, just one other thing I forgot to mention. I do have a little slideshow. Takes 3 minutes. I'll print it on afterward. It shows how that was made, time work. So if you're interested, thank you.
And then I think you have one more for us at least, right?
Released
So
one, sure. A few years ago on the East Coast called Newton Grove, which is that's a place on the East Coast. Let's see, Newton Grove.